September 1970, James Marshall Hendrix died, leaving the world to mourn the loss of rock's finest guitarist and most explosive performer. This is the story about the life and career of a flamboyant star. From his early beginnings to his innovative albums, such as Are You Experienced and Electric Ladyland. A story told by those who knew him best.
Jimmy was very, very unique. You know, I've heard stories where people came to look at him almost as like a sideshow attraction, but soon found out that he was a guy who was doing acrobatics on a guitar, you know, nobody'd seen before.
He made those records. He did what he wanted to do. That was his vision. Those records came out sounding the way he wanted them to sound.
Was nobody like him. Nobody. There were a lot of guitar players, but they weren't like Jimmy, you know.
And he was so unique at it. He was an original. He was original. He didn't copy anybody. He was his own self. And that's why he became successful, because he was unique. And there was nobody like him that ever came along.
John Allen Hendrix was born on November the 27th, 1942, in Seattle, Washington. Hendrix, originally raised by his mother Lucille, later went to live with his father Al, who then changed his first son's name to James Marshall Hendrix.
Growing up in Seattle with Jimmy was pretty fun for me. Jimmy was in charge of babysitting me while my father was working, you know, late hours. There was a secure feeling about Jimmy. It seemed to be like he was warm and he was like, you know, fatherly to me. And I always felt secure that everything was all right. And it was just me, Jimmy, and my dad living at home by ourselves. He was in charge of me. You know, and sometimes I saw Jimmy more than I saw my father. Jimmy had a very mellow personality, you know. He had this essence about him that was like really different. You know, he never hollered, he never cussed, he never got upset. He was always thinking about music. And he treated me the same way. You know, he never yelled at me. I got one black eye through my whole childhood, and I think that's pretty good for a little brother. Jimmy was shy because he was always thinking. You know, you could put Jimmy in a room with a lot of people, and he couldn't be social because he had music racing through his brain like a freight train. You know what I'm talking about? And sometimes you say, Jimmy, are you paying attention to me? He goes, wait a minute, there's just no coming through. You know what I'm talking about?
I grew up with Jimi Hendrix. I was 13. We were going to middle school, and we used to hang out together. You know, he was a good friend of my brother's, basically, you know. He'd tell jokes all the time. He loved comics. I mean, and a hell of a nice guy, you know what I'm saying? But very laid back and shy, you know, very shy. People talked about him a lot because he was so different, you know. But he was just a cool kind of guy, man, you know what I mean?
Growing up with Jimmy when he first started to play guitar was like, it was strange for me because Jimmy he was into sounds. You know, he would stretch a rubber band across the bed. We had this brass bed, you know, with the poles and stuff like that. And he would stretch strings and rubber bands, and he would make all these sounds and plucking sounds. And finally, my father, you know, came across this old ukulele with one string on it. And then pretty soon he finally got a guitar, you know, from a hawk shop for $5. And that's when he really started to, you know, pass by the sports, pass by the social activity of all his friends in the area, and start whamming on that guitar. You know, like he had a lot of friends, but when Jimmy started playing guitar, the friends kind of was jealous of Jimmy because, you know, they used to run around together and play baseball and stuff. And here's Jimmy, all he wants to do is pluck on that guitar. I remember this one story where me and Jimmy were at the park, and Jimmy's playing guitar on the hill, you know, in some bushes, and his friends came along and said, Jimmy, come and play, man, come and play. And Jimmy said, no, I want to play guitar. And they kept saying, come on, Jimmy, come on. And so then they kind of gathered around a little bit, and they said, let me see your guitar, right? And so Jimmy said, okay, because, you know, Jimmy was humble. Jimmy was like a really good guy. So he said, okay, here. And so they took off running across the field. And Jimmy was so upset, man. He was chasing them guys, you know, you could see the dust, you know, and the guys were teasing him, you know, pass the guitar back and forth from each other.
Jimmy always had his guitar with him. When I first knew him, he had a Dan Electro guitar, and I had a Dan Electro bass. That was kind of the bottom of the line, but it played and it was electric and it was great. And he would always carry that with him, slung over his back, no case, just his guitar. And you know, he was just wherever he was always playing with that guitar, always working on new licks, trying to come up with something new.
My brother played keyboards, and I played guitar, and Jimmy played guitar. That's how we struck up a friendship. You know, we used to play together daily. I mean, you know, write songs, drank wine together, you know, did things that kids actually did, you know what I'm saying? When we were small, go fishing, you know, sleep in the parks, and, you know, and just have a good time, doing a lot of things that kids did when we were small, you know, play cowboys and Indians, I mean, you know. And when we used to jam together, we used to just exchange licks, and, you know, he'd show me songs, and we'd write songs together, and I'd show him stuff that I learned, say, Jimmy, hey, look at this, check this out, Jimmy, what do you think? And he'd show me some of the things that he had created, and we'd jam daily, on a daily basis, you know. We had paper routes together, you know. We'd take our guitars, our little acoustic guitars.
Jimmy never had any guitar lessons. Jimmy heard it. Jimmy heard a music that floated through the air, and you know, and he wanted to grab it. He wanted to bring it down, and that's the only time that he heard the music, and he wanted it, and he reached for it, and he attained it.
Jimmy never took any lessons, you know, just gathered stuff from around the neighborhood, different cats. I'd play and he'd play, and Randy and Purnell would play, and he'd pick up all this shit and add his own flavor to it, and he was a monster. Jimmy was playing bass, though, on a 6-string guitar years ago, before basses were, I mean, you know, really out.
Jimmy's early musical influences were shaped from listening to local Seattle bands such as the Sharps and the Dynamics. Music historian Peter Blecker has carried out significant research into Jimmy's early musical years.
Prior to getting his guitar, he had already been a fan of the local bands. He went and saw bands like the Sharps, the Dynamics, the Frantics, Little Bill and the Blue Notes, and the Dave Lewis Combo was probably his favorite band. And so he went to the dances, he went to the shows in the armory halls and the community centers, places like that. So we know that he had an interest in music there. The next important thing I think that happened in Jimmy's life was that around the summer of 1957, some local concert promoters decided to throw matinee shows for teenagers. So groups like Little Richard and the Upsetters came through town that year, and Hank Ballard and the Midnighters came through town, and Bill Doggett. And Jimmy and his pals got to go see those bands at these afternoon matinee shows. And, you know, it's obvious that those bands influenced him.
He was always, you know, playing Elvis Presley's songs with air guitar, you know. We called it broom guitar because he would take the broom and he would practice and think that he was Elvis. And he would do Hound Dog and Heartbreak Hotel for me, you know. I used to go to sleep to those songs, you know, when I was a kid.
With so much drive and ambition from an early age, it was obvious that Jimmy's future lay in music.
I think that Jimmy was born with a drive to be a musician. It's quite audible. You can just hear it. The guy was a masterful musician. His friends from the early days, from the 1950s here, say he was a guitar master by the age of 17. You can't say that about too many guitar players.
He was driven. He was on a mission, you know, from a higher source where you've heard his lyrics before, you know. He talks about shit that, or stuff that we can't even comprehend right now, which is very true. you know, as we come to find out that in the future.
In addition to Jimmy being a fan of some early rhythm and blues bands from Seattle when he was a teenager, he also had the direct influence of having crossed paths with a couple great guitar players here in town who were a generation or two older, and one of them was named Bud Brown. He was an African-American guitar player that played with the Dave Lewis Combo. Dave Lewis Combo was seriously and, you know, without a doubt, the top rhythm and blues band in town from like 1956 until 1961 or 62, somewhere in there. And Bud Brown was apparently a fabulous guitar player. All of Jimmy's friends say that he loved him and would go to the Birdland Hall and see him play all the time. The Birdland Hall is also where a local band called the Sharps played, and they had a guitar player who was named Butch Snipes, and he was the wild man in town. He was the guy who played guitar between his legs. He played it behind his back, behind his neck, upside down. He could play it with his teeth. Some of Jimmy's early friends say that that is definitely where Jimmy learned all those tricks, or many of those tricks, from this guy.
Once Jimmy was good enough, he picked up his first electric guitar and started playing with local bands, enabling him to improve on his skills.
I'm going to take the word for some of his guitar-playing friends and bandmates like Pernell Alexander, who states unequivocally that they both got their first electric guitars after the summer of 1957. They formed a band together, and it was Jimmy's first band, and they were called the Velvetones. They played for maybe a year and a half or 2 years, as far as I can gather, and then they played a Battle of the Bands one night at a local community hall, and they were up against another band called the Rockin' Teens, and they battled, and I don't know who won the battle, but in the end they recruited Jimmy to quit the Velvetones and come and join the Rockin' Teens. So that was Jimmy's second band, and they played for a while and changed their name. They upgraded it from the Rockin' Teens to the Rockin' Kings. I guess they thought they were now ruling the town. They weren't. They were an obscure band on the scene. There were definitely big bands playing rhythm and blues in Seattle, and they weren't one of them. They were newcomers.
I had a band called the Epics, and Jimmy was playing in a group called the Rockin' Kings, but he would play with me sometime also. And then I had a band called the Knights, and he played with me then, you know. Around the neighborhood, you know, neighborhood gigs, you know, the Roy Croft, you know, the Birdland. I played with Birdland with Jimmy a lot. That was the biggest club here, you know. I remember Leon saying if you played the Birdland, you had it made, you know. And that was the place that me and Jimmy played a lot. There weren't very many guitar players around that could solo like Jimmy, you know, when he was very young, you know, very young. You know, he added different stuff to the regular music that we would listen to. He'd added his own taste to it, you know, put his own flavor on it. Now we were somewhere playing together on stage, me and Jimmy, and I was thinking it was just so natural that, I mean, I didn't know he wasn't that great yet. He wasn't a star yet, but he was a star in the community. But I just enjoyed him like he was, you know, I always idolized him and I always admired Jimmy. And it was just like playing with a friend, another friend, you know. He was awesome, but I was honored to play with him, you know, but I didn't know he was going to be such a big star.
Then Jimmy, his big step then was getting asked to join Thomas and his Tomcats, which was a band that was playing more, better, paying, and more prominent gigs. They played all over Washington State and even up into Vancouver, Canada, I think. And so those were his first three bands, and I think they pretty much played the same canon of songs.
Jimmy began to be so good, but so unique that the band members didn't want him to practice with, but they would hire him on Friday and fire him on Sunday. Because every time Jimmy would practice with these guys, he'd be doing this, like, oh, I'm sorry, I heard this thing and I couldn't get it, but you guys were playing the rhythm and blues and I just wanted to do it anyway, and that's why they fired Jimmy. But they will always hire him on Friday because he was the best guitar player in Seattle at the time. And he played with Sammy Drain and Pernell Alexander and the Rockin' Kings, and there was only a few clubs here where you could play. But then there was one giant club that if you played there, that was all over for you in Seattle, and that was called Birdland. You know, it was the rhythm and blues capital of Seattle at the time. And once you played Burnland, there was nothing else. So the only option for Jimmy was to leave. Because, you know, he was so, he had so much passion for the guitar and the music that, you know, he had to go on. Like, he would wake up in the morning and it'd be on his chest, and he would go to sleep playing it and wake up in the morning playing it, you know. We weren't proud at the time when Jimmy was playing in the band. You know why? Because my father, he only thought about working, you know. Jimmy was playing guitar. My dad said, "Oh, you're never going to make it. Give it up. I'm not playing no strings. I'm not doing nothing. You need to work." Because my father came out of depression, you know, so like the work ethic was really strong with him. But Jimmy, he couldn't be stopped. You know, he had to leave Seattle, you know, to reach that goal.
In 1960, Jimmy dropped out of high school and, to the surprise of his family, he enlisted in the US Army.
He decided to go in the Army. You know, he decided to get away because Jimmy was like, he was a creative person. He wasn't into all this emotional sociology, you know, type stuff and how to, you know, he was on a mission to play music or search for the music.
He shipped out and he went through basic training in California, and then he got shipped over to Tennessee, where he stayed in the military till I think July of 1962. So not more than 12 or 13 months he was in the military. Then he was discharged.
He broke his leg on his last jump, and so they put him in special services. You know, when you get to go to the day room and meet a couple of fellows and start playing music. And that's where he met Billy Cox. And that's when they both were on special duties.
Jimmy was discharged from the Army in the summer of 1962 and started a two-man band, The Casuals, with Army buddy Billy Cox.
They got a few gigs here and there, but it wasn't the most successful band. And Jimmy ended up just traveling around, just trying to find what to do. He came back to Seattle a couple times by bus and checked things out. And he, eventually ended up he ended up going to New York.
In 1962, Hendrix joined the band Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers and cut his teeth over the next 4 years, backing the likes of Little Richard, Sam Cooke, Curtis Mayfield and the Isley Brothers.
You've got to realise that from his background of playing with various black bands and so forth, he might have to wait the whole evening just to get a few bars break where he could shine. If you say, for instance, he was playing with Little Richard or any other band, you know, the sort of structure of the American soul bands, and you know, a lot of those bands were that the singers and the headliners, they were the stars, and they gave very, very little time to their sidemen. But even then, Jimmy still managed to stand out, you know, amongst the other guitar, amongst the other sidemen of the band. In fact, he got fired from quite a few bands for standing out a little too much, you know. They didn't like his, antics, you know. Anything that would detract from, say, Little Richard didn't go down too good, you know.
By October 1965, Jimmy had met R&B singer Curtis Knight, who invited him to join his band, The Squires. Jimmy soon signed an exclusive recording deal with manager Ed Chaplin of PPX Records. By June 1966, Jimmy would set up his own band, Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, which Mark Stein, who would later tour with Jimmy, remembers seeing perform for the first time.
I was with some friends one night, and we went to this discotheque called the Cheetah. And we saw this band, and this cat up there, his name was Jimmy James and the Flames. And this guy was dressed in this sharkskin suit, and he had real short hair, all, like straight back, and it was kind of like a rock blues kind of band. And I remember, because I saw him picking up the guitar and playing with his teeth, I said, what is this guy doing, you know?
In July of 1966, while jamming at Café Wah in New York's Greenwich Village, Jimmy's sensational act caught the attention of Chaz Chandler, then bassist for British band The Animals. Chaz convinced Jimmy to try his luck in England, and by September, Jimmy had arrived in London.
He would call us every week, tell him what he was doing. Then one time he called and said, "Hey, these people from England, you know, they want me to go to England and do some stuff. And they want to change my name, call me Jimi Hendrix instead of Jimi James and the Blue Flames." And I say, "Yeah, whatever, you know, it's cool, you know, stuff like that."
Chaz introduced Jimmy to the music scene in London, and Jimmy's incredible prowess impressed such luminaries as Eric Clapton, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who regularly made the scene to witness Jimmy's outrageous shows.
This just wasn't a band that was just passing through like a circus come to town and in 2 weeks it would be gone. I think they all realised they had a serious contender for, you know, a hot guitarist on their hands, you know. And the word really got around the English music business very quickly in the music scene that there was a new hot guitar player in town.
Jimmy still wanted his own band, but he didn't know any musicians until Chaz found the talents of session bassist Noel Redding and drummer Mitch Mitchell.
One of the most interesting things I think about Jimmy's selection of Noel Redding as a bass player was that Jimmy selected a guitar player to be a bass player. And this I think is kind of interesting because he knew when Noel showed up at the audition, you know, to be a member of the band, that he wasn't a bass player. But this didn't seem to faze Jimmy, you know. And when it comes to the drummer, I mean, Mitch Mitchell is well, at the time, he's an absolute unique drummer, you know. He wasn't a smashing, you know, he wasn't a really hard rock drummer. He came more from the jazz school, you know. And he was really into, you know, like more of the free-form jazz type of thing that Jimmy was into, you know.
The Jimi Hendrix Experience debuted at the Paris Olympia. Jimmy was an instant star. His feedback-laced psychedelic sound reinterpreted the blues and pushed the limits of rock whilst dazzling English audiences.
I told Jimmy about one of the new devices I'd been developing, which was called the Octavia, and he might be interested in having listened to it, you know, listen to it. And he said, yeah, he was really, really excited about hearing it. And he invited me down to a gig in about a couple of weeks' time, it was, at Chislehurst Caves in Kent. And backstage, before he went on stage, I brought a prototype along of this device, and Jimmy played with it backstage. And yeah, you know, that was the beginning of our friendship. And he suggested that, you know, I come down in, it wasn't about 5 days' time, to another gig at the Ricky Tick in Hounslow. And then I went to that gig, and he said, "Oh, bring along the Octavia." He said, we're going to do some recording afterwards. We're going back to Olympic Studios after the gig in Hounslow. And yeah, we went to the gig. The gig was pretty wild. Jimmy ended up putting his Stratocaster neck through a very low ceiling in the club, you know. And after that, we went back to Olympic Studios, and that was the night that Jimmy recorded the overdub solo for Purple Haze using the Octavia. And he also did another tune on the same night, another solo, and that was for Fire, both using this new device, you know.
Chaz Chandler was amazed by Jimmy and was looking to get the newly formed band their first record deal.
Chaz was very, very instrumental in steering Jimmy towards the path to success. And we used to have discussions because Jimmy, the talent of Jimmy was such that you couldn't release it all on the public at once, you know. It would be like planting a plant too soon. It would catch frost, you know what I mean?
The band ended up signing with manager Mike Jeffrey, and in October they began recording their first track, Hey Joe, with Chaz Chandler producing.
The next thing we know, we got a call from him in England, and they said, he talked to my dad and my dad said, oh, England, we don't even know where England is, And he called up and said, I'm in England now, and I got a recording contract, and my song is on the radio. It's called Hey Joe. This is before Purple Haze. And everybody bought it, and they liked me. And I'll be on TV next week, and I'll call on the Ed Sullivan Show or something, and I'll call you and tell you,
In November 1966, Jimmy began work on his debut album. And by February 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had started to record their second single, Purple Haze.
Well, I think that history will probably show that Jimmy's most memorable track is Purple Haze. Again, it came out bursting out of the chute, unprecedented. It came out in a season where lots of freaky music was coming out in the summer of love of '67, but there was something about Purple Haze that was just red hot, and it was a combination of freaky lyrics, of the power trio phenomenon of just bass and drums and this crazy guitar, and these unidentifiable guitar tones.
When I first heard Purple Haze, it was like on my neighbor's phonograph next door to me, my father's house. And then my father said, that sounds like Buster, Jimmy, right? And so, it took a couple of weeks before they met in the driveway, and my dad asked him, I said, hey, who is that? And he said, well, there's this new guy called Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix Experience. And my dad, and that's when we said, oh, what? Can we hear it? So they brought the album over, and that's when we first heard it.
We thought it was another Jimi Hendrix, and it happened to be our buddy, and we were just ecstatic when we first seen him on his first album. I mean, we were just, just excited. Everybody was excited, and we played it to death, But we seen this picture on the album, we said, that's our buddy, with Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, and I said, wow. And we were ecstatic, man. I mean, the whole neighborhood, everybody. That's our Jimi Hendrix, he's ours.
I didn't think that I had a brother that was really cool until I went on tour with him. Even after the first song came out, Purple Haze, because it was offbeat, it went dun, dun, dun. So we were dancing to disco, right? And so you hear this offbeat, and when he called me up, I said, Jimmy, you missed your beat, or something like that, and, but I had missed the beat. I'm the one that had missed the beat, and I later on found out how to, deal with it, and it was like good. It was groovy. It was new. It was different. It was unique.
As an album, Are You Experienced is it would be difficult to pick one or two particular tracks that stand out from the rest, just because as an album as a whole, it's an incredibly strong record and showcases the great variety of talents that Hendrix had as a guitar player, as a lead guitar player, as a rhythm guitar player, as a songwriter, as a lyricist, as a singer. And there's different styles of music and idioms that he is pulling from.
Hendrix had truly conquered England, and it was now time to return to America and convert its blossoming youth culture. In June 1967, The Experience played their first American concert at the Monterey Pop Festival in California.
Well, when Jimmy arrived on the scene, meaning for us in magazines, on TV, and the radio, there was no ignoring the guy. He was visually, beautiful and freaky. I don't think anybody had wilder clothes than Jimmy then or hence. Those hairdos that the boys were wearing in the band. And so he had the look, he had the sound, he had these unique songs that were unlike anybody else. And as a guitar player, he was unsurpassed.
And then when Jimmy came out with this stuff and this look and the way he was so, had so much charisma playing the guitar and singing, it's like it blew everybody's mind. It blew my mind. I'm still tripping. But my father at the same time said, oh, okay, he'll be back here working in the yards with me and you, so we can make a good living for, have children and, make a good, hard-working life. He still didn't believe until he died, that Jimmy was who he was.
In a mismatch, Hendrix and The Experience began their first US tour, supporting the world's #1 teen idols, the Monkees.
In the media, they call him the Black Wild Man, and like he's not good for a family type, he's not family at all. He's like this crazy voodoo guy, and then they would put him with groups like the Monkees. So there was more controversy there. It was like a genius stroke of public relations. The mothers of whatever it was, the mothers of the Daughters of America refused to let their daughters go see the Monkees if Jimi Hendrix toured with them.
Mike Jeffries thought that he'd scored a huge deal getting them on the tour. And of course it was completely the opposite. I mean, here we were, Jimmy on stage playing in front of 12-year-old girls who had not a clue how to deal with this. I mean, just, we didn't do that. We didn't do that many gigs. We did, here in New York, we did, I think it was 3 nights at Forest Hill Stadium. And then we did, I believe, Atlanta. I can't remember. I know we had quite a bit of fun out of it because the Monkees were attempting to be the second Beatles, and so everything was almost copied. But of course it didn't quite come off, But we had limousines laid on, so it was a big deal. For the equipment, well, for the whole tour, they had rented a plane, and they'd had it painted, and they had the Monkees logo painted on either side. And we had like 2 or 3 stewardesses, if that's what they're called, with uniforms, a little Monkees badge, and the pilot and the co-pilot, and it was really bizarre, And we had continual entertainment from Dolan, Mickey Dolenz, who, still to this day apparently is a great entertainer. And so it was quite interesting, but of course musically, sadly, it was a total disaster.
In May 1967, work began at Olympic Studios on Jimmy's second album, Axis Boulder's Love.
The record company hated the record because they said, where's the big hit? Where's that big heavy rock song? The first record did have Purple Haze and Foxy Lady and, these powerful 2.5, 3-minute songs that could get played on the radio, and or Hey Joe, of course, which was the bigger single. Axis Boulder's Love, as adventurous as the first record was, sonically and experimentation-wise in terms of the studio and sounds, Axis Boulder's Love is more experimental in terms of Jimmy's own creativity, because he started to write these ballads, more ballads.
The lyrical imagery went wild now. I mean, Purple Haze was one thing, but now Jimmy just went wild with the science fiction imagery in his lyrics. The sonic textures, again, they started getting even more complicated and complex, and with studio trickery, say that in the good sense of the phrase, trickery. And so it was much more advanced and scarier. It took a lot more to figure out, trying to listen to what are they trying to do on this album. And again, it was also loaded with particularly good compositions.
You had One Rainy Wish, and you have Little Wing, of course. Little Wing is incredibly beautiful. It's 2 minutes and 28 seconds. It's incredibly short and brilliant, beautiful ballad. No one played guitar like that. His rhythm guitar playing is just his own invention.
If you listen to those guitar licks on that song, you can hear this. That's where I think the Nashville influence is coming in. I hear some country western string bending going on in that song, and calm, beautiful, placid lyrics, beautiful stuff.
The music that Jimmy wrote that stands out for me personally is called Castles Made of Sand. And that's the story of our life story. About my mother and father arguing in the first verse. I'm the little Indian boy who, before he was 10, played war games in the woods with Indian friends. Okay, that's my verse. And then the last verse is about our mother. And when Jimmy came home, he said, this is our song, this is our family song, and it's called Castles Made of Sand.
In January 1968, the Experience were about to embark on the biggest and most demanding tour of their career. Longtime friend and tour promoter Pat O'Day was involved in many of the band's gigs.
I had started rock and roll dances early on in my radio career, and the rock and roll dances had evolved to the point that I had about 50 dances going in the state, and I would bring in entertainers and could use them for, multiple nights, hire them for several weeks. But then our first real, total, full-time client was Jimi Hendrix. And little did I know that Jimmy went with my company because of our relationship way back earlier.
The next time I saw Jimmy was in Portland at the Portland Coliseum. Was playing with Vanilla Fudge and 3 or 4 other bands. It was just really impressive to see Jimmy on stage. Kind of made us all really proud, and to see that somebody could do that. I think somebody from Seattle, even though there were other folks from Seattle, this was somebody in our class that made it, and people all over the world thought he was great, and I think it was just a real boost to everybody in Seattle. Took real pride in it.
And Vanilla Fudge was opening a show for Jimi Hendrix at the time, back in the late 60s. And I can remember going backstage, and the first time I saw this guy, it's like this incredible looking dude. It's like probably the first actual black hippie that I ever saw. He was just dressed in these real colorful vests and beautiful pants and scarves around his neck, and he had this incredible hair and just had this big smile on his face. And he was very easy to get close to. I mean, during that tour we did with Vanilla Fudge back in the late 60s, we used to hang out. I used to remember going up to his hotel room, and he used to order dinner for some of the guys in the band, and we used to just talk, laugh. I mean, obviously he was, the biggest superstar on the planet at that time, but he had a lot of respect for, other musicians, everybody, on tour with him.
When Jimmy first came home, he said, "Leon, hey, here's some money. Come to L.A. and you can be with me now." And I go, "Yeah, whoa, wow." So I flew down there. I had a limousine waiting for me. I was living at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and I'm like 18. You know what I'm talking about? So I'm like, I'm really tripping. And I meet the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Eric Burton and all these people. I'm overwhelmed with stuff, right? So I began to start to feel it. So I'm just having fun now. Jimmy's going to San Diego, Frisco, everywhere else, and I'm still having fun in LA because I am the shit now. I'm 18, got a limo, living in the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and Jimi Hendrix is my brother. I am way cool. You know what I'm talking about?
Always different, Jimmy incorporated all of his time-tested, flamboyant stage moves into his frenzied electric mixture of blues, R&B and rock at each of his performances.
Every time he performed, it was different. It would never be the same. Jimmy had an absolute, amazing, not bag of tricks, but he had an arsenal of ways of playing the song differently, effortlessly. And that's what really sticks in your mind. And so any time you ever saw him perform, it would never be the same, never. I mean, even the length of the verses or this or that, it would always be different. It would always change with the mood of himself and all the location and, and the feedback from the audience. So we talked about this, and yeah, it was like, it was like free-form jazz, you have a loose framework, but at the same time, Jimmy was such an accomplished musician and so talented that that's what he wanted. I mean, for him to, the actual concept for him to actually remember exactly note for note a solo or the way a song went was like, rubbish. There would be no reason for him to do that, not with his talent, because he knew so many ways to actually make the song sound different.
And I think Jimmy inside felt that instrument was the boss, that instrument was making demands on him, and it was his job to entertain that instrument and to challenge that instrument.
Once he made it, he was doing the same stuff that he was doing here, but he had all the equipment. And he had all those Marshall amps, but he was doing the same stuff that he was doing when we were younger. I mean, he was that good. I mean, but he had new equipment.
And he was spectacular. He could play. There was the Chicago guitar players. They all used to play behind their back with their teeth. In all kinds of ways they play guitar, and Jimmy picked it up from them and outdid them, did better than they were doing.
I suspect that people looked at him and were, you know, baffled by what he was doing. I think the general public did. I think it must have taken at least a couple of years for it to sink into anybody, and it's taken 20 years for it to sink into a bunch of other people, because now, of course, he's probably much more popular than he was then. I think just people couldn't understand what he was doing. I mean, I think they were highly entertained by him, but I don't know how many people really got it, you know, really got the music side of it.
It is well known that Jimmy was self-conscious of his singing voice, but with much coaxing, he began to sing with more confidence.
Well, what we know from Jimmy's boyhood friends is that he was terribly shy as a kid. And in the early bands, he did not sing songs. He did have, obviously, a love for the blues, and some of his early bandmates have told me that they did a long blues song in those days called Jimmy's Blues, which was an original, and but he didn't sing. He played it. And so it's well known that Jimmy, he talked about it in his own interviews, that he didn't like his own voice. He was really self-conscious about his voice, and it's also well known that what finally, you know, clicked the switch for him was when he heard Bob Dylan, and he said, "This guy has hit records. This guy has a big record contract. This is one of the biggest music stars in the land with that voice." You know, I think there's even a famous story of him calling his dad and saying that you know, man, if Dylan can have hit records, maybe I should be given singing a try.
Jimmy's confidence as a singer in the beginning was he didn't think he could sing, and it took a lot of coaxing from Chaz and everybody around him, you know, to get Jimmy to sing. You see, I mean, if Jimmy was going to sing in the studio, he want all the lights off, you know, he might have his back to you, you know, and he didn't have the confidence that he could sing. You see, but we all said, no, Jimmy, you're sounding great, you know. Please go ahead, and that was his shyness. He never thought he could sing, but he could. And the other interesting thing about it is, thinking back, that Jimmy could not only sing, he could sing and play at the same time. Now, there's not many guitar players that can do that. B.B. King can play the guitar, but when he sings, he stops playing the guitar. There's many guitar players actually physically stop playing the guitar while they're singing. Now, Jimmy could sing and play at the same time, and that is unique. You don't see that very often.
In April 1968, work began in earnest at the record plant in New York on what became the Electric Ladyland album. But due to differences within the band, it wasn't completed until late August.
Jimmy started to really get adventurous, and he wanted to do more stuff. He was talking in interviews about playing with other musicians, not even continuing to play with the Experience exclusively. He wasn't saying he was going to break up the Experience. So his line at the time was, well, there's no reason for us only to play together. Chaz Chandler quit during the making of Electric Ladyland because he was so frustrated with Jimmy's experimentation in the studio and playing with so many different people and this complete disorganization. And what's interesting is the track that he actually quit, that was the last straw, was Gypsy Eyes, the song that's probably my favorite song of all time of Hendrix's, because it's so inventive. Because Jimmy recorded the song like 50 times or something.
He was the first person that I'd worked with that used the amplifier as part of the sound, but in a big way. I mean, you know, a lot of musicians now will go up and put the feedback and use the guitar. But he was an innovator with that. He used that and learned to use that and control that to become an integral part of everything that he did. It would not be uncommon for manufacturers to come by with a wah-wah pedal or a cue box or a fuzz tone, and he'd be the first guy to put not one of those, but put 2 or 3 of those things in series, and try to see what he can come up with. So he was very sound oriented. You know, he would look to the guitar, to the amplifier, and to the studio to create the Jimi Hendrix sound. So he used all of those things, as opposed to, well, there's the guitar and here's the microphone and here's the control room. So the guitar player normally would sit out there and that with that. But he understood what could happen in here. He understood what the capabilities of the instrument were and the amplifiers. And we would blow up, I don't know, Marshall amplifiers. I don't remember. We must have blown, I remember 2 or 3 within the span of 2 weeks, and we just blew them right up because it was so loud. And that was part of his sound. He would create a lot of those things right on the spot. It wasn't planned. You know, he didn't say, I think I'm going to go and do this. He would go in there, and for hours, and the tape would be running, and he'd come back in and say, let me hear what that sounds like. Because in the control room, you could turn it down, and the hardcore reality was there, well, there's that little speaker. And he would listen and understood, well, if I do that, okay, then he'd go out and try something else. So he was a great experimenter with sounds.
In the summer of 1969, Hendrix broke up the experience and reunited with old army buddy Billy Cox on bass and with Mitch on drums. And the newly named Gypsy Sons and Rainbows Band headlined the Woodstock Festival in New York. In December, Jimmy began 2 nights of shows at the Fillmore East Club in New York, replacing Mitch with drummer Buddy Miles. The shows were recorded for the Band of Gypsies album.
It had inauspicious beginnings because the album happened in the first place because of a lawsuit with Ed Chalpin. Jimmy had signed contracts when he was a studio musician to satisfy and to try to take care of those legal responsibilities to Ed Chalpin. They gave a record to him and to Capitol Records from a live show. They specifically organized these 4 live shows at the Fillmore East, New Year's Eve, 69, 70, and recorded those shows and put out Band of Gypsies. The funny thing is, for many people, that's their favorite Hendrix album of all time, which for him was the most, you know, thrown together, offhanded record. But that's part of why Band of Gypsies is such an incredible record. It's very live. It also it shows the beginning. It's the beginning of the last stage of Jimmy's career as an artist, as a creative artist. The music is very different. Billy Cox is in the band now. And as soon as Billy joined the band, the music itself changed tremendously.
What Billy brought to the band, with Noel stepping out for a while, was he, I believe, was a more accomplished and more soulful bass guitar player. I've already given credit to Noel for what he brought to the band, but Billy was funky. Billy had already played in heavy rhythm and blues bands around, and he knew exactly what it took. He wrote some great bass lines to new songs by Jimmy, and they lost a little bit of the twee psychedelia that they had originally formed with in London, and they just got rootsier and funkier, and you know, it was probably out of necessity. They were, you know, hanging out with the Black Panthers by that point and stuff, and you know, playing gigs in Harlem and things like that. So I think they just got rootsier, and Billy helped that process.
So in that last phase of 1970, following the breakup of the Band of Gypsies, and then once you get into the spring of 70, Jimmy started to record again, primarily with Mitch and with Billy, and was writing all of these songs that were following that same strain that he had started with Band of Gypsies, these bassline-oriented songs. And some of the great examples of that are Dolly Dagger. Dolly Dagger is a fantastic song, very heavy with the bass lines.
Sadly, Jimi Hendrix's brief career ended on the 18th of September 1970. He was only 27 years old.
Angel is a very spiritual song for me because it almost foretold his passing on, you know? Remember, Angel didn't come out until after Jimmy was dead. But when I heard it, I mean, I cried and cried because he said that he's leaving. He almost told me, he said, you know, I'm leaving now. You know, I gotta go, you know?
He died because, well, he would drink beer and just whatever, and he took sleeping pills. And this one night, he was in London. He had to come back to New York for whatever, and then I was supposed to work with him. And he went to sleep, and he got sick, and he vomited, and he choked on his own vomit. So he did not die from a drug overdose. I know the difference between drugs, and he did too, and he knew the difference between that and a sleeping pill, because Jimmy, you kept his hours and went to the studio at 6 o'clock in the morning, and you know, to go to bed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and that screws up everything, especially there's a 6-hour difference between London and New York, and it wears on you, especially keeping those hours. And that's what he did, and that's how he died. And I remember that because I remember we were supposed to be working on something that was done from one of the older sessions, which required record plant to be involved, and I was there, and he never showed up.
When I heard Jimmy had died, it was incredible. I happened to be, I was living in Long Island, New York at the time, and I had a band called Boomerang. And I was in the shower getting ready to actually go to Electric Ladyland, Jimmy's studio in the Village that morning. And Jimmy Galuzzi, you know, the drummer in the band, the late Jimmy Galuzzi, said, Mark, you know, get out of the shower. You said you were not going to believe. You're not going to believe what I just heard, you know. So I'm turning up the shower, I'm drying up, and he goes, what? He goes, Jimi Hendrix is dead. I said, what? I mean, I was just, you know, blown away, obviously, and so what are we going to do? We're supposed to go to the studio and meet Eddie Kramer. We're going to lay down some tracks as we're trying to, you know, get a new record deal together, and he was potentially going to produce it. I said, I don't know what to do. I mean, it's just like everybody was in a state of shock, you know, so you know what? Let's just get in the car, let's just go. So we drove into the Village, and everybody was just in total disbelief. And I remember walking into the studio, and I actually see Eddie there in tears. I put my arm around him and saying, Jesus, Eddie, just like incredible, I can't believe it. So everybody was just stunned, walking around, and I remember Noel Redding happened to be outside, and it was just incredible. It's still hard to believe that happened.
In October 1970, Jimi Hendrix's funeral service was held at the Dunlap Baptist Church, Seattle.
I remember seeing him in the coffin. There was an open casket. He looked so waxen. He was always so vigorous and dashing like a buccaneer. He dressed like a buccaneer.
Jimmy's service was simple, to the point. Deep grief on the part of his fans that were there, couldn't believe what had happened. I mean, he went out so young with, I think all of his fans dreamed of being able to spend the rest of their life musically with Jimmy, and that he would continue to contribute in the years to come and continue to give them the thrills that he had brought them so far. So the grief was deep, the shock was substantial, and in a relatively simple way, simple and uncomplicated way, we said goodbye to Jimmy. It was all so sudden.
James Marshall Hendrix was buried at his family's plot in Greenwood Cemetery, Renton, Seattle. Tony Bongiovi produced the last of Jimmy's posthumous albums.
Well, in Jimi Hendrix's situation, there were lots and lots and lots of material that was recorded. Now, after they were able to assemble all of those recordings that were intact, where he had finished them, there was nothing left to release. So I was called in by Warner Brothers, because I had worked with him so closely at Record Plant, and I knew a lot of the material. And they said, we would like to involve you in the production of some of these recordings. Now, I'm not very happy with what I did with Midnight Lightning. It was so difficult to do Crash Landing, but it was such a challenge, a technical challenge, an engineering challenge, and a musical challenge to make that record go together that by the time I came to Midnight Lightning, it was just, I was out. I was burned out. There was no more to give. And, of course, that record didn't do as well. But when Warner Brothers says, I want another record, you pretty much have to do that. So that's how those two posthumous records came out. And those were the two last records that were done. There was a whole series that were done, but those were the two last ones. And then, of course, they came out with compilations of greatest hits and things like that. But those were the two studio records that were made from the last piece of tape that had the last bit of recorded sound that could have been salvaged to make a record out of. And then I said I can't do it anymore after that.
Jimmy took the stage by storm, finding huge success with such hits as Purple Haze and The Wind Cries Mary, and albums Are You Experienced, Axis Boulder's Love and Electric Ladyland, which were accepted as trailblazing masterpieces. He should be remembered as a legend whose recording career transformed the heart of rock and roll.
Jimmy will be remembered by his music because you can copy it and play it, but you can't create it. And Jimi Hendrix is like the Beethoven of the 20th century, okay? Look at Beethoven. Every time I hear Beethoven, I know who it is, you know? And in the future, every time you hear a Jimi Hendrix song, you're gonna know who in the hell it was. It was Jimi Hendrix.
Jimi Hendrix should be remembered as the king, the greatest guitar player that ever lived. I mean, he was the epitome of the entertainer, I mean, musician, the guitarist. I mean, the best in the world. Like I told the mayor, he revolutionized the whole music industry. And he made such an impact on the whole world.
I think he's going to be remembered for someone who was very innovative and different, and who left a distinctive mark in American music and globally, too. And he was one of the first people that paved the way for the album trend kind of records. He was selling albums when people were selling singles. So everything about what he did was unique and innovative, from the studio to the way those records were sold.
I think that the reason that Jimmy will be remembered forever as a musician is it's a combination of great hits, nice warm singing style, and he was the premier electric guitar player of the 20th century. I don't think anybody's denying that, but what I really think his accomplishment and contribution was ultimately was as a pioneer of using electronic distortion.
Hendrix is the greatest rock guitar player that ever lived, and someone who represents all of those things that he has always represented, which is forward thinking and trailblazing ideas, and you know, just being a mother on the guitar.
My memories are constant right now. My memories of Jimmy are still in the present time because I hear him on the radio, I see him in my dreams, I hear his music. You know, everybody knows Jimmy, knows me. I'm like, it's like he's not even dead.
He's not gone. His spirit's here. I mean, and his legacy lives on. I mean, you hear stuff today, and that's 30 years ago, man, and it's still fresh. I mean, it's still fresh. What can you say? And I love it every time I hear a song on the TV or advertisement of Jimmy. Just makes me happy, you know. I hear Voodoo Child on the CDs, you know, on television, and I say, yeah, recognize, because he was the man.